Is this thing working again? Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Al. It was good hearing you and your perspective. On the latter topic, I don't think personally, in my own personal viewpoint, not on behalf of anybody else, that I personally agree with you. The next session is going to be less about model regulations and more about the perspective of what's going on with respect to smartphone applications around the world. We've been doing a lot of technology. For the last couple of years, we've had, at least at the ITR and also at the AGTA, they've had a lot of technology on their on their agenda for the AGTA meetings I've been attending. But this is Technology Day. It's called Big Data Day. A lot of people don't know what big data is. We're going to talk about what we think it is. We're going to talk about concepts, I think, such as the digital mesh, and whether smartphone applications are have nothing to do with transportation, and maybe they're just a means to another end of selling other things. So whether our industry is a vehicle for other things and gathering of data about selling other products and getting ice cream trucks to deliver the nearest ice cream truck to your block, I have no idea what the future has in store. What I do know is that we have a recent phenomenon known as ride sharing, which has reared its head with many new things that usually come out of California. And it's been really, from a regulatory perspective, a very unique challenge to try to reconcile this with the way regulators do business and the way the industry does business. So this panel is intended to talk more about the various perspectives of different stakeholders, and I'm going to bring up some of these stakeholders now. They're each going to say, if there's no PowerPoints, this is a panel discussion. They're going to say a few words about what their perspective is, what's going on in their locales, and what they think about the smartphone applications. So we're not going to talk about model regs now. That's going to be reserved for the 2:30, I think it's the 3:30 session, which is an open session, and anyone who comes will get the new model regs. But we would encourage the panelists to talk about the model reg process and how it has helped them or hindered them or whatnot. All right, so the first panelist we'd like to introduce is our friend from Down Under, Blair Davies, the Australian Taxi Industry Association CEO. Blair? Okay. I know you're a little jet lagged, but we're going to get you up here. And as I indicated, we're very, very pleased to have Bill Jonas, who represents all of the Australian regulators on our board of directors. Good morning. We have Jay Bregman, the CEO of Halo. Is Jay here? No? No Halo? Yeah, I guess so. Wasn't at my party, I'll tell you that. Okay, well, if he comes, is anyone from Halo here? I'm sorry? He is, okay. Maybe someone with, we all have technology, or maybe we could text him. Halo. I saw like 20 people from Halo here. I mean, if someone could come up, that would be fantastic. Oh, excellent. All right. Nothing like a wake-up call. Steve Humphries, the CEO of Flywheel. Is Steve? Okay, Steve. Okay, we got our panelists. Okay. But be careful. Okay, FTC is in the room, okay? Well, actually, the successor to Flywheel was Cabulous, which I think Chris Hayashi could back me up. I think was the first entity that started all this stuff. Yeah. Bill Rouse, the TLPA president, and an excellent operator out of Los Angeles. Welcome, Bill. He's been very involved in the app issue for the last year. It's been a heck of a presidency, I guess. Bobby Worth was very worried. He was worried.
As well he should be. I'm very excited.
We have Abu Azam, the landside director at San Francisco International Airport, also known as SFO. Abu, are you here? No Abu? Abu, is that, okay. Good morning. And we have, and obviously Abu's going to be representing, along with Ray, who left us, the airport's perspective on this issue, especially with the ride-sharing issue. And last but not least, we have Mr. Rich Antonacci, the Executive Vice President at Signature Financial. I know Rich is here. I saw him this morning. Good morning. Rich is going to, I think, lend a very interesting perspective. A lot of people have not been really thinking about this, except for behind closed doors. Really, what is the impact on the Medallion asset in closed markets of all of this app stuff that's going on? To the extent that he can say things, not against his best financial interests, Rich, I think, is going to provide a global overview of what lenders are feeling about all of this. Okay, so without further ado, why don't we go facing the stage left to right, starting with Blair, and maybe take 5 to 10 minutes to talk about what's going on in your jurisdiction and your perspective as a stakeholder and where you think this is going. Apps, ride sharing, and anything else you'd like to talk about.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of the Australian taxi industry and also the regulated community down in Australia. We are very interested in the apps environment, as you guys are over here in the US. I suppose the first thing to say is that Australia is a much smaller market. We're about 1/10 the size of the US, but we do embrace technology, and so we've been playing in this app space now for the last 2-3 years, and pretty much all of our taxi networks in the capital cities have developed their own apps or bought in apps. And just in that space, we've been doing credit card acceptance for the last 25 years, so that's not new. We've been doing digital dispatch and GPS dispatch for probably the last 15 years. So as a taxi industry, we're embracers of technology as opposed to folk that watch it go past. From our point of view, we're struggling with how to regulate this new technology. From an industry point of view, we just see it as another means to book a taxi, and so it's a relatively simple thing. The same rules that apply to our taxi networks should apply to the app providers. So you can call for a cab, you can message for a cab, you can use an app to get a cab. It's basically the same deal from our point of view. We don't see it as an e-hail. We see it as just another means of booking a cab. Interestingly enough, our regulators see it pretty much the same way, but in Australia there's a reticence to regulate some of the new entrants to comply with those requirements, and so that there's no compliance, and I think that's possibly true over in the States as well. So we're in that same sort of space, I think. And I suppose in defence of our regulators, their approach is a little bit of a watch and see how this market plays out, because the new app providers, we've got a couple of local variants, plus Uber started up in Sydney, seeing how they impact the market and whether they're going to make much of a dent on things. Because as I say, the existing service providers all have their own apps, and so it's a fairly congested marketplace. From the industry's point of view, then our position is not dissimilar, I think, to the intent of the model regs that are coming out of IATR. We believe that apps have to satisfy 7 mandatory criteria, and they are safety, and in that respect we'd expect that an app dispatches a request to a real taxi driven by a real taxi driver. In Australia, those taxi drivers, for example, have been through national criminal history checks, they've been through medical exams, they've been through something like a week to 2 weeks of training, which we call a national competency at Certificate 2 level. they've also been screened by their cab companies as well. We're talking about, as a second criteria, service quality, and we expect that the apps should perform like our networks. Our networks are required to report to government and deliver on response times, and they're also required to provide additional support to customers when they have a difficulty in a cab. So if they've got complaints, they go back to the cab company. They need to be able to field those complaints and actually investigate them and do something about them. They need to be able to help passengers find lost property, those basic sort of things. Our third criteria is fares and payments. We believe that the meter rates are what passengers should pay, and it's a regulated environment. Taxis are an essential service, and therefore the customer should be able to pay the metered rate. And that's a regulated rate in Australia. We'd encourage regulators to think about allowing a deregulation of premium services, but the basic meter rate is something that the customers should be able to get, and they should be able to do it with or without a credit card. For us, having accepted credit cards and debit cards for the last 25 years, there's nothing new there. We expect that the customer should be able to determine which way they want to be able to pay. Importantly for us, the fourth criteria, no discrimination. We have great concerns about schemes whereby drivers rate passengers, and as an industry we've been trying to drive out the circumstance where drivers refuse fares. Refusing short fares, refusing to go in particular destinations, that's not part of the service. It brings the industry into disrepute, and quite frankly, it diminishes the industry's capacity to impact society for good. We provide mobility to everybody as an industry. We are a public transport service in that respect, and we don't want to see the introduction of a technology diminish our capacity to do that. Importantly for us, wheelchair accessible taxi services need to be part of the scheme as well. In Australia, on average, we've probably got 10% of our fleet is wheelchair accessible. In my home state, if you call for a wheelchair accessible taxi, you should be able to expect that to turn up in the same time as a conventional cab. And so the standards for us are on 85% of occasions in off-peak times, that taxi turns up within 10 minutes, whether it's a sedan or whether it's a wheelchair cab. You've got to be able to book a wheelchair cab via the app. Responsibility is the fifth criteria for us. The passengers shouldn't have to supply indemnities to the app provider. The app provider should be responsible for the services it provides, and shouldn't be seeking to avoid those. And similarly, drivers signing up to these arrangements shouldn't be expected to commit to unlimited indemnities. There's a commercial relationship there, but that market power shouldn't be exercised against and to the disadvantage of drivers. Our sixth criteria is accountability. The privacy of the passenger needs to be protected, so there needs to be arrangements in place to protect that. And the overall operational performance needs to be recorded and made available. And one of the things that we've seen is we've moved off to embrace technology. There's a huge amount of data that's available to the cab companies to improve their service, and typically our regulators have joined in with that and are using that same data. We expect that if there's going to be demand for taxi services moving off to other players, not a problem, but they need to be providing that information back to regulators and back to the public so that the public can have confidence in the services being provided. And our last criteria is that they should be lawful. So whatever the regulations are, everybody plays on the same level playing field. And lastly, while I've got the microphone, because I'm not sure that I'll get it back, just a couple of comments about regulations. Our approach in Australia is that we are an over-regulated economy. We have acquired regulations like a comet going through the atmosphere. Regulations seem to grow, and in fact the average small business person in Australia is unaware of all of the regulations they're expected to comply with. No surprise, that's also true of the US and virtually everywhere. And so we're very big on the idea now that our regulators need to be looking at regulations and judging them by 3 criteria. The first is that they're appropriate. There is a real market failure, and if you don't regulate, something bad happens and you don't want that to happen. The regulation needs to be effective. So whatever it's aiming to address, it actually has to hit. Now that seems obvious, but I think everybody in the room as a regulator would know, on occasions you've got this great intention and it sort of misses the mark, and there's an exercise in spin to make sure that people don't sort of hold you accountable for it. And the third criteria is that it's efficient. That you not only are addressing a real market failure, that you're actually hitting the mark, but you're doing it in the least cost approach. And it's keeping it simple because, as I said before, we tend to be over-regulated, and what we need to do is actually lighten that regulatory load and make sure that it's cost-effective. And in that space, the cost of the regulation needs to be less than the cost of the market failure as a principle. So, as an industry, we are not a supporter of deregulation, Karen, sorry, but we believe in good regulation, and we believe in appropriate regulation. And in that space, we think that there is a place for IATR with its model regs. We commend your organisation on that. We'll be encouraging our local regulators to be looking at regulating in this space. But again, it would have to be appropriate, has to be effective, has to be efficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Blair. I'm glad you brought up the comment theory. There's an excellent study that was done many years ago on regulatory accretion. I don't know if Dr. Mundy may have, I don't know who the consultant was, but in any event, I found the analogy very interesting. Steve, you're next, Flywheel, but just on the fly, I thought maybe, pardon the pun, it might not be a bad idea to mix it up a little bit, and maybe one of our other panelists could ask Blair a question that they have for Australia. And then at the end, after the speakers, we'll open it up to questions if we have time. Does anybody have a question for Blair? He wants the microphone back so badly. No? I mean, I have a question. To what extent did, and I found it fascinating that you guys have, the regulators have service requirements that, which really seems to be the essence of why apps even exist right now in some cities, is because the regulators in Australia require that you prove that a cab has been dispatched to the location by regulation within a certain time period. And if not, there are fines that apply. So maybe we could elaborate a little more on that. And is that something that you think has prevented there from being an incredible proliferation of apps in Australia, because there's actual service standards built into the law?
Yes. Our approach and our industry approach, look, it varies across Australia, but as a principle, we see that the best way to protect the industry's interests is to deliver service to customers. So that's the long-term game. And importantly, then we work with regulators to encourage them to have the same goals. Because fundamentally, regulators are in that space, aren't you? You're actually trying to make sure that the community gets a good taxi service. So in that area, particularly my home state and also the Australian Capital Territory, implemented as a regulation that the taxi booking companies or dispatch companies had to deliver services within those response times. So on 85% of occasions, the cab has to turn up within 10 minutes in off-peak times. On 95% of the remaining 10% or 15%, 10% of that needs to be done by 18 minutes. So 85% within 10 minutes, 95 within 18 minutes. And that's, now that was introduced probably about 12, 14 years ago in Queensland. With the industry's support, there were no penalties, and then about 5 years ago, there was some new contracts negotiated, and the booking companies are now facing fines if they're not meeting those performance requirements. from an industry point of view, there was a little bit of pushback originally when those targets were discussed, but using that phased implementation, the industry embraced the response times, and our view would be that's driven service levels better and higher, and consequently our view of the apps is a little different than it is in the US. Our view is that they're going to have to perform on their merit as opposed to performing in a space where people can't get a cab and these guys are offering a completely better service. As I say, I think it's a competitive area. It's a market where people need to perform, and they can't just expect that they own that market because of some sort of history. And I'd encourage you to look at response times as a performance indicator for your local industry.
Okay, we see Jay's joined us from Halo. We actually just changed the format briefly. Steve is going to talk a little bit now from Flywheel. We're going to go back. We'll go back to you, Jay, at the end. But if other panelists, I would encourage you to think of at least one question to pose to Steve so we could have some interaction, or Ray, of course. So, Steve, maybe we could talk a little bit about your perspective as a legal app.
You bet, will do. And if the breakout yesterday was any indication, there'll be plenty of questions. And thank you all for those of you who came to our breakout yesterday. A lot of you did, and the interest and engagement was terrific. The breakout was about legal apps, and I think what Blair was just saying, service to customers is what it's all about, and there are legal ways to do that. There's a very important, I think, regulatory role in that, within the right limits, but certainly a very important regulatory role, and that's what we were talking about yesterday. As Matt mentioned, we were, I think, the first, or at least one of the first apps out there, as Cabulous at that time, and now as Flywheel. This was back in 2009 when we launched, and since then we've always and only worked with legal licensed taxi fleets within your cities. And that's the model we started with the entire view that what we want to do is bring greater service to the infrastructure that's already out there delivering 1 billion rides a year in this country. So there's plenty of infrastructure. How do you leverage that and make it as effective as possible for customers? And that's what we've been doing. And the results have been very positive. 95% of our rides are rated 4 or 5 stars by our customers. So the taxi drivers out there in our cities are delivering good rides. And in fact, 2/3 of those are 5 stars straight up. Now there is some self-selection. The drivers in the fleets that are proactive and adopt technology like that are often the ones who are working hard to deliver the best possible service. And so that's where you get that rating skew a little bit. And we, of course, work as well with the fleets to make that happen. But it's clearly deliverable, and it clearly is all about customer service. It also clearly expands the market. In markets where we've gone in, as well as these other services, but where we've gone in with the legal fleets, the market grows. It's not just taking the phone dispatch customers and converting them to app customers. We're finding that additional customers come and take rides. In fact, my wife is in LA right now, taking taxi rides all around using Flywheel, whereas a month ago, she would have gotten a rental car, no doubt, and gone around that way. Instead, she'll probably take a half dozen cab rides this week that she never would have taken a couple of months ago before the convenience and access was out there. So we can expand the market, and we can support the market with metered fares, transparent fares, accessibility, and we're therefore supporting the market which you all have regulated and put in place for the consumers in your cities, whether they're elderly, whether they're handicapped, whether they're in economically disadvantaged areas. The taxi fleets serve all of those areas. What's happened, of course, is because companies like us showed this marketplace out there, venture capital has poured in. There's over $500 million of venture capital that's come into this industry in the last 2.5 years. That creates massive economic pressure. So, and you know, where there's economic pressure, the boundaries start getting pushed. And sometimes they get pushed beyond what's appropriate for our citizenry. What we're trying to do is a quality of life in our cities. So you will not find a ramp van on a Lyft app, right? If you're handicapped, Lyft isn't going to help you. A lot of times at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, when you're elderly and you want to get to your doctor appointment, you're often not going to find a lot of these cars. They're going out, they're skimming the cream at the rush hour times when the clubs are coming out, and they're taking demand that the taxi fleets are trying to balance and provide service to all of our neighborhoods, and also provide service and make them a lot of their money at some of these peak times. And you need that balance. You know, if you really want to know where this is going, one of the most well-publicized moments was after Superstorm Sandy in New York, when a service provider came in, one of the app providers, and charged 3 times the rates to drive people around after the superstorm. Now they realized that that wasn't a good thing to do, not because it was wrong, but because they got terrible PR, and so they pulled it back. But if we don't watch, I'm not going to name names. That's, you know, there's enough names of the behavior out there.
Are they here?
They probably are here. But what's important is that is a indicator of what's going to come. And I also am not a big advocate of regulations. This is my 4th startup. I've done 2 IPOs. I love the free market, but I also recognize that in several years, if we don't have balanced service provision in our cities, then if you don't have good PR, which if you're handicapped or elderly or disadvantaged, you are not going to get the service you need. We do depend on you all to set those parameters so that service can be fair and equal for everybody. And it doesn't happen entirely through free markets. And so I just think that's very important that we talk about here today and we engage with. The other thing that I want to talk about is the effect on the industry. In our breakout, we use the music industry analogy. When Napster and some of the sharing happened, there was a lot of economic force behind, oh, let's all have free music, let's go for it. Fortunately, there were some bodies that rallied together, and eventually you got the benefits of the free-for-all. You can buy a single track on iTunes. It costs you 99 cents instead of free, but you don't have to pay $10 for the whole album. So that same benefit can be delivered within a regulated environment by free market economics. We're all going to go out there and we're going to fight. And believe me, there's plenty of capital, there's plenty of market here to go after. If the parameters are set right, you can have a win-win. You can have great service as well as free access, and we've seen that before. I've seen this, in my technology career before. Larry mentioned one thing in Australia. There's, if I may quote, a reticence to regulate the new entrants. And I'm here to tell you, startups don't need to be handled with kid gloves. In fact, they need sometimes pretty strong guardrails, because we're going to push really hard against every boundary there is, and probably through some of those boundaries. So it's very important that those boundaries be set where you want them to be. If you don't want them to be anywhere, that's okay. You can set that, but expect that we will go wherever those boundaries are. And I speak as an industry. We ourselves are very comfortable within the licensed legal taxi fleets. There's a huge market out there. We're deploying as fast as we can. Growth is not limited by any of that, but others will be coming from different directions on that. So the message here is it can be legal. I believe we have the best technology out there. We were certainly the first technology, and we continue to innovate around that, and the best customer experience you can get, all within legal regulated parameters. You don't need to compromise on that. I do think regulations are very important. They do have to be set carefully, but make no mistake, there's a lot of pressure on you all, and it's going to be coming from economic forces. I know you all feel it already. You're going to set your parameters as regulators, and there's going to be political back pressure all over the place. We actually would like to help as much as we can in that dialogue. But the back pressure is going to be huge. We launched in LA a month ago, and 5 days later, one of our rideshare competitors engaged the Englander Law Firm, which is the biggest law firm in LA and has some pretty deep roots into the board of supervisors there. Those guys don't go out for less than 6 figures a month. So there's a lot of pressure that's going to go on all sides, and we might as well acknowledge that the economic pressure is going to be there. But if you all can hold the line, and we can help you hold the line, we can demonstrate this is going to be a much bigger market for everybody, and it can still be fair and equal access. People can get ramp vans. There'll be service in disadvantaged parts of your cities, and it's going to be a win-win. But ultimately, the win is going to come through back to what Blair was saying, service to customers, is we've got to always be making sure whatever regulations go in place don't impede providing great service to customers, but they don't need to be service stopping at the same time that you're being fair and equal.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Anybody have a question from the panel for Steve?
I do. Jay,
Oh.
any
Could you pass the microphone? Thanks.
And I apologize, I was late, I was with some venture capitalists, so, sorry.
Yeah, that's all.
Just kidding.
Hello? That doesn't work. Anybody hear me?
Hi.
Here.
Has there been any limitations to raising capital based upon the methodology that you go to market?
Based on the methodology that, sorry?
You go to market. In other words, you're choosing the path of least resistance as opposed to this gentleman who's trying to do it through what we're referring to as a legal way of doing business.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I
Hello?
understand the question.
There you
I'm
go.
sorry. Hey, we got. So my question is when you have discussions with private equity firms, has your go-to-market strategy facilitated raising equity because of the way you go to market versus what Cabulus now Flywheel is doing as a more legal standard way to go to market?
Okay, so what do you mean by our go-to-market strategy? So I'm not clear on what the difference is that you're trying
Well,
to
your go-to-market strategy, meaning it may be operating outside of the regulatory framework that's established in the cities.
I'm sorry, that's news to me. I mean, we are members of we work and engage with many of you in the room. In every market that we've entered, we've engaged early and before we've entered the market. We are licensed in cities like New York City, where we're part of the eHealth pilot. We are licensed in Toronto. We are licensed in Chicago. Where cities have a licensing scheme, we participate in it. We are often the first to participate in it. Where they don't have a licensing scheme, we work with them to make sure that we are within their current regulations. So I'm sorry, I just don't understand your question.
Well, that's great. So my follow-up question would be is what is your opinion on those that maybe choose a different path?
You know, I guess I'm really pissed off. And I was going to save this for my speech, but I guess I'll say it a little bit right now. I'm really pissed off because I go to dinner parties and I go to cocktail parties and everybody talks to me about why is there taxi regulation and why do you have to do it? Jay, why do you play by this? Why do you bother to go through all of this stuff? Why do you talk to these guys, right? Aren't they just bona fide tax collectors? And it really, really pisses me off because I tell you, I know, and you know, and I think everybody on this panel knows, and Matt knows for sure, that this just isn't a game. This is about providing a safe and quality service that is essentially the core transportation and circulatory system of every major city in the world. So why would we not want to work with them is the question that I have, and why would anyone not want to work with them? So I can't comment on why people have done what they've done and the approaches people have done. What I can say is there is another way. You do not have to be an outlaw. You do not have to act outside the regulations to provide great service to your customers or to provide a great additional source of income for both your drivers and the fleets in which cars they drive. Really, technology can lift all boats if you just do it right.
Thank you, Jay. Steve, one question. So in a similar vein for Cabulus, has there been any higher receptivity to your business model from people that you talk to? Or have you experienced, I'm sure they discuss both types of modeling to you when they go to raise capital, so maybe you could share a little bit of that with us.
Yeah, no, the question always comes up, as Jay said, all I want is a level playing field, and it's really a pisser when people can come in and not insure their vehicles, not have them maintained. They take a private car and they start driving at 100,000 miles a year, where it was driven 10,000 miles a year, and no brake inspection, no nothing. Given a level playing field, I go to the investors and I say, look, the fleets are managing the cars. They're doing a lot of work. We're adding value in terms of the apps and the access and the consumer access and the experience on that side. That's all we want to do. We want to create that consumer experience that's superior. But leverage, everything is being done in a $50 billion industry already, and not spend money investing in and building our own fleet. The investors actually love that. They just ask questions are these guys going to be brought up to a level playing field so that your strategy works? And the answer is right now, it's working great. And I think it is going to catch up with them. whether it's regulation or market, it's going to catch up with them. But the investors love the story, in fact.
And, maybe we could segue, and since Bill is from California, he could answer this question and give his presentation, but is it perhaps a broader issue in terms of raising capital? Is it a Silicon Valley issue that the investors there feel that we can throw hundreds of millions of dollars or something and we will win no matter what? Kind of feeling that they're above the fray of the political democratic process. Is there, I don't know, I'm from the East Coast, so I don't know what's going on. I think I understand millennials, I think I understand the younger generation and the smartphones, but I think also the very, very rich people that are making these investments, I almost think it's almost a philosophy that crosses industries. I'm just wondering, Bill, since you're from LA.
And I'm a, what, venture capital specialist?
No, I don't know.
Or just a rich guy?
I don't know.
I'm a taxi guy.
I was trying to move the panel along. If you, maybe some of these guys who recently asked for capital could answer the question first. I don't know.
I'll hand this to someone else.
Sorry, Bill. I was trying to segue. It didn't work. Well, you guys both got some revenue, so you had to make the pitch to these folks. I mean, what do they want to hear? How much you're going to break the law? I mean, what are their questions?
Well, no, I mean, so it's first of all, we are from, Steve and I, although we're very similar in our approach, we're also from different parts of the world. So Steve is from the Valley, I'm from New York, and our company's headquartered in London. And there is a big, a big difference there, but a similarity, I think, in approach. No, I mean, raising capital really is normally about, is about the ability to make a return. But I'll tell you, I have been in a room with an Uber investor who has said something to the effect of, we think that regulators are just tax collectors, and this is all just bullshit. So, and they've never been stopped in any city. I've heard that from their mouths. It's astonishing. Our investors would not say that, by the way, but there are different classes of investors, just like there are different classes of companies, just like there are different classes of anything else. The key thing is that I think there are certain companies like us in Flywheel who enter into this market, who seek to evolve, who seek to build on what is already there and seek to make it better. And then there are certain companies who basically think that that's just too much work, and they want to wipe the slate clean, and they want to create an alternative network for some reason, in order to just wipe everything out that exists. Destruction rather than evolution. That seems to be, Steve accepted, the cornerstone of Silicon Valley versus venture capital elsewhere in the world. And I think that's led to some very bad places. So, Steve, you must have some comments on this.
So in venture capital, they're typically very, very rational. And most investors look at this, and they look at a company like Jay's and Flywheel, and they say, this is value add, it's building a market, and there's money to be made there. And they like the analytical approach that says you build on the strengths that's there, and we call it disruption from within. You go ahead and disrupt and break the things that need to be fixed. And we all know there's things that can be improved in any industry. So investors get that, and that's what they're investing in with us, and I think that's what they're investing in with Halo. Things get frothy at times, and this is what's definitely happened here, is things get frothy. The Wall Street Journal did a big analysis on markets, and on Uber's market in particular, and they said, these guys are in a niche right now. The mass market is what we're talking about here, and what you all regulate. It's the tens and hundreds of millions of rides that are happening all the time in the US. And that's what rational investors look at, and they say, that's where we want to put our money. That's the mass market. It might be harder, and it might take a little more time, but that's ultimately where you're going to win. But, capital goes through these flows. As I say, I've done this a number of times. Bubbles happen. I think there's aspects of this which are a bubble.
I think we may want to save some of these questions. It's a great discussion for Mr. Gavel, who's here from the FTC, for his luncheon, because it raises the issue of is it really fair competition when people come in with hundreds of millions of dollars and attack an industry and reduce competition among many mom and pop shops that are out there? Not a cartel, but small. Most limousine companies are small, tiny companies, 2, 3, 4 limousines. Who's really unfair here? But we'll save that for lunch. It's going to be a great. Is Andrew even here yet? Are you hearing all this? Andrew, hello, Andrew. It's going to be great. We can't wait. Our next speaker is Bill Rouse, who's going to talk on his perspective, not just on TLPA's behalf, but his own personal perspective, I'm sure, on having a business that's been in LA for many, many years.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Bill Rouse. I'm president of the TLPA. I manage Yellow Cab of Los Angeles and 4 other fleets in Los Angeles. Our operation is about 1,200 taxi cabs in the greater Los Angeles area. On that last topic, before I get into my points, I think we cannot forget that, and Christiana, I'm not attacking you with this, but there was a structural problem with the supply of taxi cabs in San Francisco, and San Francisco is iPhone Mecca, and unless the regulatory process is meeting the needs of the population for the transportation that they need, we can expect people who are really smart to go out and find solutions. And I think that was a classic case of necessity breeding invention, and now we have a monster on our hands. I want to thank the AGTA and the IATR for having me here today. And I additionally want to thank the IATR for all of their work on the app issue across the country. It's been a pleasure to work with IATR members on the issue, and in spite of some outcomes perhaps that we might disagree with. When I looked at the topic and I thought about the impact of apps on airports and cities, obviously we have to start with the question about whether they're legal apps or not, and my 2 previous speakers have already touched on legal apps and the benefits through the booking process, transparency to the customer, increased service levels and reliability, increased efficiency for both drivers and the companies that use them, and obviously the ease of payment. So there are obvious reasons why every taxi cab operator and every regulator should be trying to push towards maximizing your use of mobile devices. It's where the world is going, and we encourage, at TLPA, we encourage all of our members down to the smallest markets to find a way to adopt this technology and apply it to their business for the obvious benefits for the customers, the drivers, and the companies. Our concerns about the impact on airports and cities have to do with the policy objectives that we see and we have seen over the years that cities enact through their taxi cab regulation. And so those are something as basic as revenue to airports. And in Los Angeles, and I apologize, I'm going to be giving a lot of examples based on my own personal experience, but we have a taxi cab industry whose fees were quadrupled. We have a limo industry that pays its fees. We have an airport shuttle industry that pays its fees. The car rental companies pay their fees. The hotel shuttles pay their fees. Everybody pays their fees except for these misnamed ride-sharing services who are coming in and clogging up the airport by circling around again and again and not paying any fees at all. So clearly, airports, which are trying to maximize revenue and looking for other revenue sources, that is a major problem. Additionally, as I just mentioned, congestion management. Every airport deals with congestion management issues, deals with curb space issues and allocation issues. And now we have a new commercial transportation provider that's flouting all of those laws or regulations within the airport. Sustainability and air quality objectives. Most airports I know consider that a priority. Certainly cities consider it a priority. When you look at San Francisco and you see that, the reduction in emissions from the taxi industry is one of the major contributors to the city reaching its overall reduction in emissions, reaching those goals. In Los Angeles, we've reduced fuel consumption by over 40% by moving to hybrid vehicles, and we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions by almost 40%. And now what we see today are people who are not merely getting out of hybrids and into gasoline-powered vehicles, but they're getting out of the cleanest hybrids and getting into the dirtiest vehicles. And I'm talking about Escalades and Suburbans. And I know, I live in an area, believe it or not, there are areas of Los Angeles that are very walkable. I walk a lot. I've got my eyes on the street, and I see black Suburbans racing up and down residential streets like I have never seen before. And the impacts on air quality, well, if it was good enough to get the cab industry to green its fleet, it's obviously the negative impacts we would have to all acknowledge by passengers now providing or jumping into these dirtier cars. The safety and insurance issues, they're obvious. Background checks, real background checks. I'm not talking about going to some subscription service that looks at a snapshot, an incomplete snapshot of what the database shows. I'm talking about using the governmental provided, in many states we have the LifeScan system, but in California it would be California DOJ, that provides not just a look forward, but not just a look back, but also a look forward. If any of our drivers are arrested for any reason whatsoever, within really a matter of hours, the regulatory body will be alerted to that arrest, and precautions can be taken. That is not the case with the program that was recently passed by the PUC, and we think that that is a compromise on public safety. We think it's an obvious compromise on public safety. Drug testing, in California we've had mandatory drug testing of cab drivers for many years. It's a successful program. Contrast that with what the PUC has provided for, which is a zero tolerance policy. So we're in a dark Suburban in the back seat, and we, the passenger, are supposed to know that the driver's intoxicated, and we're supposed to report it to an app company that doesn't provide phone numbers. It's a completely, obviously broken system. And by the way, for those of you who are not in California, and that's most of the room, they don't make those promises to you, so I can't imagine that any of those, even those rudimentary safety precautions would even be practiced in your state. Vehicle inspections has already been touched on. The issue of insurance. This issue of ride sharing was an attempt to bring the entire industry within the scope of a section that allows people to carpool to work. And it was an obvious sham, but a second part of it was that it forbids private auto insurers, in the case of carpooling, from disclaiming insurance coverage when people are carpooling together. And so they're not ride sharing. In fact, one of the ride share companies testified at the PUC earlier this month that they're still working on the ride sharing concept. So an admission that they're not ride sharing. But in any event, through filings through the PUC's process over the last several months, the California Personal Insurance Federation, which is a coalition of the largest private auto carriers, alerted the PUC that there was no coverage for private auto for commercial auto activities. And yet these companies have persisted in this sham insurance model. And so to me, it's obvious that they are knowingly putting customers and the public at risk by having uninsured vehicles on the road. And I can now speak from personal experience. Two of our taxi cabs have been involved in accidents with Lyft vehicles, and we've received denials of coverage from the carriers, the personal auto lines carriers, because of the activities, the commercial activities that the cars were engaged in. And so there is no insurance for these trips, and so regulators should obviously be very, very concerned about this. Other policy objectives that may be considered by airports, but certainly are considered by cities: living wages for drivers. The concept of public convenience and necessity is a balancing of supply of vehicles with the need for vehicles, and one of the things, the factors that cities look at is how much are drivers making. And as we flood the streets with these unregulated vehicles, we're seeing driver incomes drop, and that's, if that is a concern for you as a regulator, then obviously your regulatory objective is being threatened. Universal non-discriminatory service, Blair touched on that. Accessibility, Blair touched on that as well. And then the last thing is the imposition on cities of the resources to enforce the law against these businesses. So, for instance, the California Public Utilities Commission has forbidden the rideshare companies from acting like taxi cabs, but they don't provide any investigators whatsoever to any city anywhere to make sure that they're not acting as taxi cabs. So the imposition is now on the cities, whose resources are completely strapped, and now they have to go out and be the regulator of the state regulated, the local regulator has to do the job of the state regulator. And so it ends up being an unfunded mandate, and so you as regulators, you have that to look forward to as well. On a broader scale, we're looking at the overall problems of a deregulated market, which has been shown again and again and again. Cities like Seattle, Sacramento, Indianapolis, and many others have experimented with deregulation. It does not work. We have lower driver earnings, lower quality of service, higher instances of bad behavior as drivers have to maximize revenue out of less trips, higher traffic, lower vehicle quality, higher fuel consumption and emissions. That's what we see in deregulated markets. That's what we will expect to see here. And so, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that's the impact of the rogue apps that we see, and I appreciate the opportunity once again to speak with you.
Thank you for your insight, Bill. Do we have one question from any other panelists? Blair, for Bill?
This should be friendly.
It is. Bill, the industry works very hard to lift its standards and to drive out things like predators driving cabs. And people now take that for granted. What can the industry do to help regulators point out the good things about regulations that are being taken for granted, which will be the baby that gets thrown out with the bathwater if people just throw out the regulations? What does your company do?
You know, a lot of what's going on is not a technology play. It's a marketing and public relations play. It's a supply play. Yes, there's enhanced technology there, but legal app operators or app providers are providing the same level of technology. And that's not to take away from the amazing technology that the illegal app companies are providing. They're obviously working very hard, and they're very well funded in order to do that. But the public relations aspect has been a challenge. Our industry's image has taken a big hit. The TLPA considers it a priority to educate its members about service quality improvement. And you know, I think working with your regulators, making sure that you're using the latest technology, peeling back the onion on your operations, and making sure that you're providing an adequate level of service within the means that you have. Making sure with the regulator that you have an adequate supply of vehicles to provide peak levels of service. You know, and then sitting down with the policymakers and educating them about how the industry works. It really has to come down to that sort of one-on-one communication, making sure the regulators understand your contribution to the community in terms of universal, non-discriminatory service. Those are, I mean, that's what I would tell every cab company to do.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I think you raised the issue of why are some of these apps so angry? I mean, very angry and hostile. And like Angry Birds. I mean, but it's you know, it wouldn't actually, you know.
You're not talking about me.
No, well, no. But there are some that are just angry, and even the ride shares are a little angry. They're supposed to be hip and nice, and you know they hire these like really, you know, these really aggressive lawyers and lobbyists, and I just kind of feel that they would not be relevant if they weren't angry and fighting, and I kind of feel it's part of a marketing strategy that if you're legal, it's not hip, and it's not. And we know, for those who deal in the media, legal is not something you print. Oh, I abided by the law today. So I think we all know what that's all about. But I'm glad you touched on the PUC decision, because it's really self-regulation. It's like, you know, going to a Rite Aid now and you just, you know, check yourself out and, you know, you scan your materials. It's even worse than that. I think that decision was very unfortunate, personally, my own viewpoint. But I think you did touch on something which we might want to follow up with, which is an inherent contradiction, both at a high level and a legal level. You mentioned, and Bill, you come from California. California, as Tom and Chris and other regulators know, on an environmental standpoint, is the most progressive, okay? With air quality, congestion mitigation issues, unlike any other state, and which has actually pressed forward, talk about disruption, pressed forward against the federal government and the Clean Air Act, and actually has its own gold standard that has emissions ratings way above and beyond any other state. Yet, despite that philosophical context, you have millennials, you have people who are the younger generation who are now using smartphones and love this stuff because they don't buy cars anymore. The car culture, there's a great article in the Times. I teach this, by the way. I teach sustainable transportation. I teach these students who believe that the environment comes first and smartphones come second, or one or the other. The inherent contradiction is, look, in New York, when we put new medallions on the road, we were required by environmental law to do an environmental impact study. But my question, and this could be a great legal panel, Ray, in the future, is to get environmental lawyers to say, the CPUC's decision is de facto flooding the market with these cars that are going to hurt California's air quality. You're taking people that are going to be driving around, and I raised the question of whether environmental impact statements or an assessment is required by government actions that lead to deregulation and to flooding the market. It's an interesting question. I do teach environmental law, but I'm not an expert in it. But I think that would be a great panel, and I don't know, Bill, you're a lawyer, but I don't think you've dabbled in that.
I'm not a CEQA lawyer. CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act. I have heard, and I've heard testimony and I've read testimony that CEQA would be implicated by the PUC's decision, and so we'll just have to see how it plays out to see if there's a challenge to this decision based on CEQA. I do not know. Frankly, I don't even know who has standing to assert it.
I think Jay wanted to add something, and we're going to, Malachi, I think we should discuss putting it on the agenda in New Orleans. Yes.
Just want to ask a question. Bill kind of talked about jurisdictions not having staff to do enforcement. And when you think about what these industries are doing, they're using public relations to promote the benefits, but they're not telling you the whole story. And I think that it's important for us as regulators, as well as the industry, to use our resources, because we all have family and friends. And as easy as it is for us to get an app, if they came to New Orleans, we would be more proactive than most of the other individuals, because we would have our family and friends get the apps, they would order the cars, and then we would arrest the individuals. Any non-licensed folks, that's what we would do. That's the same type of things that we did when I was in Atlanta. So if you use the technology, and every time somebody pulls up and you have a non-licensed driver, use your phones. You have phones, take pictures of it. That's something that you can use as far as public relations to show how you're putting the public at risk. So they can focus on the benefits. We want to focus on the full picture. And that's something I think that everybody in here needs to push.
Thank you, Malachi.
Could I just
yeah.
add one more comment on that? Yeah, I mean, it's one of the ironies in this whole dynamic to me has been that some of this started out of San Francisco, where we're pretty socially progressive, and we care about disadvantaged communities. We care about the elderly. We care about the handicapped. We care about taxi drivers having a fair living wage. A lot of these things have started up with no reflection of what's the, are Lyft drivers earning minimum wage in California? Do we care about that? And whenever I sit down with folks,
They passed the drug test.
yeah, whenever I sit down with folks and we sit and talk about it, you really get traction with, oh yeah, this is not the social compact that we want. We don't want to have, just the law of the jungle and every man for himself. If you don't have enough income, we don't really care. They really do want to support all these things that Bill was talking about and that Blair was talking about before. That and we have to get the message out. I think it really is a lot of messaging. The technology can deliver the benefits to consumers. We need to have the social conversation and not be afraid of that. That's very important. And the millennials that I talk to, as we talk about that generation, they're happy to engage in that conversation. Someone needs to engage them in it. That's all.
Someone
we need
needs to
use
tell them
word.
that you could hurt the environment, and maybe they think twice about it.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Anyway,
Matt, can I
we
ask-
do
can I
have to
ask a
move on.
quick
Okay.
question?
Sure.
Oh, sorry, one quick question for Bill. This is I'm Ario from Super Shuttle. Bill, you mentioned you had a couple of accidents with Lyft cars, and that their insurance didn't cover it. I'm just wondering what happened after that. I mean, you reached out. Did Lyft cover anything? Because I know they talk about they have a policy. Did the driver have to pay the difference? I mean, what was the final outcome of those situations? Because that's something that we're really concerned about from the passenger standpoint.
So in one case, we have a formal denial of coverage from GEICO. The driver received the denial of coverage as well, and he's called us to try to settle the claim. At the same time, we did receive a call from Lyft's, what they call their excess carrier, and they said they're evaluating coverage. They've had that in their hands for well over a month, and we're not sure that there is coverage yet. The other case involves a State Farm policy where we've only received a verbal denial of coverage, and I think that they think the case is closed. And so, and by the way, in both of these cases, fault is not in dispute, and so that's not an issue as well. My point is that there's a pretext that the driver's personal auto is even in play at all here. And that pretext extends across the boundaries of the state of California to the entire country. So even though the PUC unwisely entered into a settlement agreement that requires these companies to maintain an excess policy, and their use of the word excess creates coverage issues as well, because excess is a follow-form policy where the underlying policy is what establishes coverage. So it invites a coverage battle in every single case, because the excess over the personal where there is no coverage, and then couple that with their blanket waivers of liability, which would also get rid of the need for insurance, then you have a potentially uninsured situation. We are third parties. We're not passengers. We're not the driver. So we're not covered by the blanket waiver because we didn't sign it. We're outside the vehicle. But right now, the short answer to your question is there's still open claims, and nothing's been settled with them. But beyond California boundaries, I haven't heard anything that they maintain this excess coverage over the personal auto that doesn't cover these claims.
Okay. Just one quick comment from Jay, very quick.
Yeah.
And then Abu's going to come. Abu has a very quick PowerPoint, so Abu, why don't you come up here?
So I have a very quick comment on California, and this is not about the entire state, it's about the decision. It's an experiment. There have been many experiments like this in the past. I think we're probably spending too much time on it, to be perfectly honest, given the facts that still need to be proven. The case that comes to mind most aptly is relay rides. I remember I was vividly on a flight reading the New York Times about how relay rides, a company that was going to revolutionize peer-to-peer travel when it came to being able to rent out your own car with $1 million insurance policy that would protect you and anyone else. So what happens? An MIT student rents out her car. She's a Google employee, actually. And then it turns out that she gets a phone call from Relay Rides a couple of days later, says, your car's been totaled. Okay, all right, we'll send you a check for the entire car. What they don't say is that driver killed 4 people, including himself. and that incident well exceeded the $1 million policy. And so suddenly now the insurance companies turn around and say, wait a minute, we did not cover and factor into our decisions about premiums this sort of activity. We covered the person that was supposed to be driving the car and maybe their trusted others. So, and as a result, they're now banned in New York City. They received censure from the New York City, or the New York State, Insurance Board. So my view on these experiments is that we should treat them as such. We should treat them seriously. But at the same time, I think that companies that operate in this sector will wind up becoming insurance companies, and that's a very difficult thing even for the deepest pocketed venture capitalist companies and private equity firms to fund.
Just one quick response from Bill, because he's aching.
I'm chomping at the bit. No, my problem with the concept of this being an experiment is that is two things. One is this is going to be the roadmap that the rogue app companies trot around from state to state. See, look at what California did, and try to get it replicated in from state to state. So I'm not confident that we should be cavalier about what's going on in California. And the second thing is really even more serious, which is that this experiment, it requires us to suffer all the harms first. And so people will be injured, people will be uncompensated, people will be harmed by drivers who did in fact fail taxi cab background checks and moved over to these other modes in order to provide this transportation. We know this. All the harms associated with deregulation will be suffered, even though we've learned them for decades and decades. All the reasons for taxi cab regulation, each rule in the taxi cab rule book is there for a reason, and it's there as a product of decades of trial and error, and now we're just going to have to learn all those lessons all over again through this experiment. The PUC is a 5-person body with extraordinary powers in California, and I'm just going to say this. We, the cab industry, treated that process like a quasi-judicial process when it was not a quasi-judicial process in good faith. What it was a lobbying process, and we got out-lobbied. We got outflanked on the lobbying front from well before the process was initiated, and we got beat all the way down the line because we were very late engaging lobbyists and getting into those offices and communicating. Yes, we were able to bring about some positive changes to that decision, including on the issue of insurance, which is very, very important, both in terms of public safety and in terms of creating a level playing field. But the fact is we got out-lobbied. That's the reason why we lost. And so I just wanted to respond on the issue of the experiment.
Well, that's a good segue for Abu. I could tell you, someone from New York, we really don't ever follow anything that California does, with all due respect to my friends in California. If you look at the circuits and the federal courts, California always does its own thing. And in fact, the actual reality is that in Maryland, in Austin, in New York, in Philadelphia, city after city, they're not doing already what California. So it's irrelevant. The CPUC, I pray for you. I pray for you in California, I really do. But we also have in California our next speaker from the SFO who actually shut these guys down and is totally not on the same page, in my view, with CPUC. So let's learn a little bit. I have to have the greatest respect for you and your folks over there as an airport, Ray. These guys really stepped up to the plate and gave an excellent presentation there. So we want to learn more about SFO and your take on this issue. So Abu, why don't you join us? We'll give a quick PowerPoint, and then we'll hear from Rich and Jay, and then we'll open it up.
Quite a segue there, Matt, but I disagree with you. I think New York tries to follow SFO on environmental issues because we're, as you said, always on the forefront of environmental things. And matter of fact, I have a quick announcement for a few operators that are here. This morning, Airport Councils International North America awarded SFO the 2013 Environmental Achievement Award. And that's because, thank you. That's because of stewardship of like Super Shuttle and Go lorries with the Go system, SFMTA Taxi, Chris Hayashi, SFO Shuttle, Jeff Leonidakis, who's here, Clean Energy. All of these folks participate in our programs. And yes, it is a regulatory program where we put clean vehicle processes in place. where we've created this environment where we clean up our carbon footprint at the airport. So just wanted to mention that. Anyway, we did take a stand when these companies started coming in. I think there's some newspapers on your desk about taxi cab times, and it has the Lyft company on there, Mustache. So we got a call from one of our operators early on, taking pictures and video footage of these folks dropping people off, and immediately we started doing research on who these companies were and started sending out cease and desist letters to them because they did not have an airport operating permit. So that's how we started this process. I have a brief PowerPoint presentation for you to kind of explain to you why we did what we did, and all the things that Bill mentioned, I agree with. That's California. This is how we do it to keep a level playing field, all of those things. I'll go through a couple of these slides here with you. The first thing I want to tell you is the SFO also got an award recently from Leisure Travel Magazine for being the most transit-friendly airport in the nation. Although we're 8th as far as distance from a city, we're still the #1 in transit-friendly modes. And when we consider transit-friendly, we're looking at all the modes, not just our BART system that comes there, but our Samtrans, our taxis, our shuttles, all of those things. So airport, in '96, our commission adopted a transit-first policy, giving priority to high-occupancy vehicles and professionally operated transportation services. Based on those policies, SFO has the following goals. We reduce traffic congestion by encouraging public transportation. So we actually do marketing campaigns with our local media outlets during holiday season and those times, advising people to take alternate transit rather than come in their vehicles. The other mandate of the policy was to minimize congestion on airport property, reduce delays, and have dedicated zones for ground transportation operators where they could quickly drop off, pick up people. Passenger safety, vehicle inspections, commercial insurance, all of those was part of the requirement to set up a process for the ground transportation operators. Airport security database, having knowledge of who's on our property at what time, because we have an AVI system that tracks all vehicles that are ground transportation vehicles, so we know which company is there at any particular time. DMV notice, pull notice program, where if somebody's license is suspended or if they get a DWI, we would know that, and then we would suspend that operator from operating on airport property. Cost recovery, level playing field, as mentioned by Bill earlier, and there are all of these operators that operate at SFO that pay a fair share into the usage of the roadway. I have a slide that shows how we calculate that. So here are some of the ways that SFO, folks at SFO or passengers come to SFO. As you see to the right, we have future modes, high-speed rail, which we're planning on connecting with, and technology network companies, which is what we're all talking about. Here's a little slide that gives you a breakout on the percentage on how people get here. If you look at the bottom number, we have 44,700,000 passengers that go through SFO on a yearly basis. And that's the breakout of how it breaks out. Permitted vehicles at SFO, we have 1,916 permitted operators, which follow the rules, have insurance, all of those things. And 8,701 vehicles, which each and every one of those vehicles we inspect to make sure. We have 3 dedicated mechanics that go through the vehicles to make sure that the vehicles are compliant and all the issues are met. And here's a breakout. The largest portion of our provider is a limousine operator, is a limousine mode with 3,825 vehicles. Taxis being next after that. Taxi trips, we roughly average 5,000 taxi trips a month. On a peak month, we've hit 9,500 trips out of SFO. Here are just some numbers for taxi trips. Limousines, we've seen since the advent of Uber and these other applications, we've seen a 150% increase in the number of permits that people have applied for, thinking that they can make a living working for Uber and other folks. So we've seen a lot of permits, and we're kind of inundated, and we're looking at staffing issues and all those kind of things to address and make sure that we still continue to inspect all vehicles and do the right thing that we've been doing for many years. As I mentioned earlier, transit first is our policy, so we try to advertise and try to tell customers that you should take BART, which is our local transit provider, which is a zero emission getting into the airport, and our ridership in August was 450,000 people getting off and on BART. So here's a little chart of our domestic terminal roadway. This is the lower level of the roadway. I basically have 1.5 miles of roadway to deal with 44 million passengers coming in. So that kind of tells you it's a challenge. I have to have dedicated zones for ground transportation providers where they can come in, pull up, drop off, pick up. If it's not there, it causes chaos, and that's something I wanted to mention. As you see, this gives you a little clearer picture. This is our international terminal. We have different zones for different folks where they pull in, drop off. Passenger enplanements, we've seen year to year, every single year we've seen an increase going forward, and we're continuing to forecast an increase at SFO. The next slide should show you what our current employment is, 44.7, and this year, 2012 to 13, we've seen a 4% increase. Comparable to other airports, LA is 3%, and the rest is showing there. So we are seeing additional passenger growth, which means I have to deal with the traffic congestion, I have to deal with all the other issues that come with it. We just recently finished a ground transportation master plan where we were looking at how we'll manage our roadways going forward in the next 20 years. We are kind of in a tight pinch because we are locked from one side by water, and on the other side we have no room. We have a domestic garage, and we have no other property where we can expand to, unlike Denver or Dallas where they have plenty of property. So that's my other challenge. So I have a brief little video that shows poor planning, what poor planning does, and it's not trying to pick on anybody, but just kind of wanted to show why we're trying to manage our roadways, and I think you'll probably get a kick out of this. And it's no offense to my Indian friend from India there, it's just something that I'm an Indian, by the way, so. So this is a typical intersection in India, and this is what happens. And we try to avoid this at the airport at all costs. Yes, and we try to. So, as I mentioned earlier, we did a master plan, and part of our master plan, what we do is we put in our forecasted numbers go into the plan, and we extensively model our roadways to see how it's going to play out with all these numbers of people coming in, all these different modes of ground transportation. Here's a clip from that. There's there you go. So as you see, that's modeling of our roadway. Basically, the yellow vehicles you see are taxis going around. Each different vehicle shows you what it is. Limos are black there, and the green vehicles are going to Terminal 1. Then we have orange vehicles going to Terminal 2. So we go through great lengths to really figure out what it's going to do to our roadways, because we don't like congestion on our roadway. We like people to have a pleasant experience, come in, it's a customer service move, all of those kind of things. So when new applications or new modes are introduced, we really have to look at them closely to figure out how they're going to fit into the system, or if they even fit into the system. And that's where we're at the moment. We were on the CPUC rulemaking process. We participated in that. We commented on that. We said they should be regulated, all of those things, and we're on record saying all those things. Let's see if I can go to the next slide. Anyway, so the level playing field, where does that come from? Well, we're mandated by the FAA, really, to, under the Airport and Airways Improvement Act of '82, we're mandated to have a sustainable airport, which means we're supposed to collect revenue from every single source of entity that's doing business on airport property. That includes our concessions, that includes ground transportation, airlines that lease space, so we're mandated by that. These are some of the rules that basically govern how airports run, and how we're grant funded by the airport, by the federal FAA and the airport improvement programs, and how those function. So how do we calculate ground transportation cost? I mean, how do we make the playing field level, really? We take the annual cost of the airport operations and maintenance, then we exclude cost from airfield terminals, public parking, buildings, grounds, et cetera, to get ground transportation operating expenses, basically. Included in those are the debt services for capital improvements, roadways, staging lots. GTMS is our ground transportation ground transportation management system, which is our AVI system. And those of you who are not familiar with AVI, pretty much tracks all of our ground transportation vehicles around airport property. We have readers, and as these vehicles go through, they get billed for making a trip through the airport. So it's comparable to what you call a toll lane or tollway. All ground transportation, total ground transportation is calculated that way. Then we allocate ground transportation cost by projected vehicle trips made by each individual mode. Now, how do we have that? That goes back to the big data conversation. We have a lot of data from all the AVI reads on which vehicle is making what trip. And that's how we figure out the total cost for that mode. And then we divide that by the number of vehicles in that mode. So if limousines increase in that mode, then they see a larger divisible factor there. And that's how we come up with trip fees. So that's how we make it really a level playing field for everybody. So everyone that's participating in our roadways, using our roadways, and are providing service and making revenue off of that service, we charge them a trip fee. Anyway, in summary, basically, we take every opportunity to promote transit, to reduce congestion, and reduce our carbon footprint at the airport. Self-sustainability is a big thing for us. We have innovative programs such as our CNG program, and we work with the MTA on their hybrid taxi program, which 95% of the taxi fleet in San Francisco is hybrid or alternative fuel. Our main focus is to reduce congestion on the airport's roadway, as I mentioned earlier, addressing future traffic growth as we see it coming, and improving our carbon footprint. Those are our main reasons. And then, as I said, level playing field for all the operators that are operating there, so no one operator is disadvantaged over the other. That's why we took the stand of really putting out cease and desist when we started seeing these illegal companies starting to come on airport property. It's like, you're not paying your fair share, you're not legal, you're not authorized by the state to operate, and therefore we put our cease and desist. With that, if there are any questions.
Any of our panelists have a question for Abu? Thank you, Abu. What do you think is going to happen to ride shares in the next 5 years?
Well, since the CPUC, I don't know, I mean, the CPUC has already ruled. I mean, we kind of were waiting on the CPUC ruling, but there may be still appeals to that process. I'm not sure how far that's going to go. We're just waiting to see, because the CPUC also still has another 45 days to implement their ruling and put something in place. So we're monitoring all that to see where it goes. We'll have to manage our roadways somehow, and we have to figure out how this mode fits in if they're allowed to operate in San Francisco or in California legally.
Chances are then they'll have to be permitted and
Correct.
charged fees.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Yes. All right. So our next speaker is Rich Antonacci, who's going to lend his expertise on the impact on lending. Richard?
Thanks, Matt, and I'll be brief to give Jay some time to talk at the end. But first of all, I want to thank the IATR for having me on the panel. You know, it's a privilege to share your perspective, but more importantly, to learn from the perspective of others. Just a little bit about who we are. We're a national specialty finance company, and within our company, we have a transportation finance unit, and a subset of that is our taxi finance lending unit. So we do a lot of lending in markets around the country. And, you know, as lenders, we're risk averse and by our nature, so it's our job to assess risks in markets that we participate in. And clearly, the lower the risk, you know, the more conducive to lending. So, for the most part, the transportation markets that we lend into have a history of stable and effective regulation, and all of you are part of that. They limit and control the supply of the licenses, and they enforce and defend the licensee rights, which is a critical component to effective regulation. And two subsets to those markets are medallion markets, which is a vast majority of the lending that we do. And we take an asset-based approach because there's a secondary market for medallions that are traded in an open, transparent fashion. And at any given moment, we know the value of that asset. And then there's non-medallion markets, which have similar characteristics, but there's not a transparent secondary market or active secondary market. So we take a more traditional lending approach, relying upon the financial resources of the transportation company that we may lend to. And as part of our strategic planning, we do routine market studies of a lot of markets across the country, and we also try to stay up to date on what's going on. And we're well aware of bills travails in Los Angeles, and it's been quite an interesting thing to kind of look back in my chair and see what's happening, and sometimes not understand the logic of the decision making that's going on. But anyway, in the market studies that we perform, we look at other factors, not just the ones I talked about, like quality control, vehicle fleet standards, the passenger experience and safety, the microeconomics, like the supply of labor and where it's migrating to, and lastly, technological advancement, which is pretty much the subject of this panel discussion. And from our perspective, we kind of break down smartphone companies into two separate categories. The app companies that work with established transportation concerns to enhance the delivery of their services, a value-added product that does not elevate the risk of lending into that marketplace. The second set are app companies that really act like transportation companies, but they use technology to deliver their product. They tend to work outside of the regulatory framework, and this will elevate the risk and can destabilize the market, and I think it has already begun to destabilize some of the transportation markets we lend into. And we see them creating disparate treatment. If you have 5 companies that are performing a transportation service and you treat one differently than the other 4, you're giving them a competitive advantage, in our opinion, and that's disparate treatment, not just for the businesses, but also for the consumers that consume the product, because the other 4 guys have a responsibility to service the entire community, and the other company may not have the same go-to-market strategy or consumer metrics. Anyway, we kind of look at this, and I apologize for being very simple, but there's no doubt in our minds that these rogue app companies are transportation concerns. At least that's how we feel. And in some cases, we think of it this way. They recruit drivers to work for them. They disseminate a dispatch system, which is maybe the more modern dispatch system. It's a two-way radio that acts as it's a smartphone. They use software to calculate the rate of fare, which is what a taximeter does. And they collect money and pay the drivers. So, there's far more similarities to those entities than there are differences, and that's why we support the model regulations that have been promulgated by the IATR, and we're big supporters of the association because I think we're all in agreement that this is what we should be doing. I think how we have to do it is probably more of the question, and how we can organize our efforts to be heard. And I think that's the important question to answer. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Rich. Any questions from the panelists for Rich? Okay, you want to seek some capital so that you can go against the, what's interesting, I don't know how much you're following what Rich, right on point, what Rich is saying is what's happening in Miami as we speak. Miami is a unique market. It's a medallion market on both sides where there's a cap on the limos and the taxis, and as a lawyer, it's probably the best regulatory taking lawsuit I've ever seen in my lifetime, where you have a clearly defined property interest in the law, yet the current proposal on the table, whether I don't know if it's going to pass, but if it does pass, it's a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit that will bankrupt Miami-Dade County. And I looked at it. It just seems to me that if you just start letting entities come in and just do whatever they want, you're just taking assets and just completely devaluing them. That's what we call a regulatory taking, whereby regulation is the same as the government bulldozing a property and taking it by eminent domain to build a highway. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution requires that you get just compensation for your property interests. Now, wouldn't we be upset if your home was taken from you and you were basically told, well, that's just too bad. Technology it dictates that your home just be taken away from you. I mean, it's a real, look, we're regulators, but let's see the other side of this. There's a whole other side to this thing, and that's a very, very real, God knows whether there's any lending going on. I basically was told that most everyone has stopped lending in Miami right now, which is because of this. So this is real, and it's happening, and it's crazy. Anyway. You can ask a quick question, and we're going to go to Jay, and then Ray wanted to say something. And we're going to keep going a little bit because people seem to not be leaving and paying attention. Even in the back, hi there, how's it going? We're so we got coffee coming around. We're gonna have a break. People are bringing the coffee to you, so just stay where you are. Steve?
Okay, this just be 15 seconds so we can get to Jay. But maybe the answer is what you just said in Miami. But I've been curious about this. Is the Medallion base is a massive asset base. New York alone, Yellow's $15 billion asset base. So we talk about $500 million of venture capital coming in on the app side. But there's this massive asset base with an interest in the value of what exists out there. And I was wondering if there's been any organizational attempt to defend that asset base in a customer-friendly way. Everyone wants to serve the customers. That increases the value of the medallions, but not to have them undercut by things changing in dysfunctional ways.
Do you want to answer that?
I'll try.
Okay.
Well, interesting enough, Steve, there's so much going on in New York with the green taxis and a lot of other fronts that they've had to do a little bit of battle the fleet owners on. They have organized in many ways. I think the most effective, at least at this point in time, lawsuit against those companies emanates out of Chicago. Maybe you want to touch on that for a second, Matt.
Well, I don't want to take too much time from the panel, but I think the New York case is very, very different in a lot of, it is a takings case in Chicago, but New York, is very distinguishable from Miami, even Chicago too, because they have, like in New York, they created a separate class. They created another entity that's fixed. It's a big difference between that and just letting, the cows come home and just putting the whole thing out to pasture. And, it's probably a controversial analogy, but, I kind of feel that you can go from, you could see organized countries going from communism to capitalism. You can't go back, okay? You can't build a system, okay, and then where people have property and money invested and just, it was very easy for Russia to say, okay, we're going to build a capitalist system because there was nothing there. You can't just take things that people own and say, okay, bye-bye. That happened in the Dinkins administration when the green taxi plan was floated. The lawyers said you cannot do this because we're going to have to pay $1 billion, right, Victor, to buy all the medallions back if we're going to be putting these grant. So this is real stuff. This is not a joke. This is billions of dollars. It's not fat cats. There are individual people that put their life savings on the line, and I think we gotta at least take that in consideration.
It's really no life savings. It's that the average loan of a medallion is 70% loan to value, and guess what's backing those loans? It's people's houses. Right? So,
Jay, we need to take Jay, why don't we just continue with you?
Yeah, so
You just keep going.
continue that. So it's more important than just the billions that are invested. It's that actually, one, these are mostly individual entrepreneurs, but those loans that are leveraged to buy those medallions, the loans leverage on average 70% loan to value. And guess what's backing the equity in those loans? People's houses, right? So that's really the system that we have. We've seen this movie before, right? Too big to fail. This is too big to hail. It's exactly the same thing. It's set up exactly the same way. So anyway, let's get started about the nice stuff. So
That's right up there with the comet analogy. I love it. We're doing good today.
Thank you very much. So I give you another one. So there has. I've been here for 2 years because that's the amount of time that I've been in and had the pleasure of being in the taxi industry. By the way, sorry very much. I really do apologize for everybody for being late this morning. I blame Tom, our head of North America, because I'm very happy to announce with some degree of effort, but also a lot of cooperation on the part of CMT and Verifone that Halo will be the first a fully integrated e-hail and e-payment provider in New York City sometime this week. Right, Tom? Or today even? I don't even know. So thank you very much to both of those companies and for Tom for your efforts in making that happen. As I was sitting here, I was thinking a lot about Harry S. Truman, because Harry Truman was another famous Missouri resident. And there's a quote that I just can't get out of my mind, really, where he said, in reference to what was going on in World War II and all the turmoil around him, if we don't make a mistake, what a paradise we can make of this place. And that's really what I feel our opportunity is here. We talk about the negativity, we talk about the turmoil in the industry, but really what's going to happen here is all of you and all of us that participate in this are the catalyst for the biggest thing in technology today and the biggest thing in technology tomorrow. This is going to emancipate people's lives on a scale that is unimaginable, and it's happening right here. So I am very proud for Halo to have been and have been a member of the taxi industry with Flywheel from day one. A lot of people might know a little bit about us. So, you know, we were started by 3 taxi drivers. So we've had that in our blood and in our DNA since the very beginning. We're now in 12 cities, including Osaka in Japan, which we just launched last week. And I'm still deciphering the news coverage of it, but it looks to be moderately positive. And really what that shows is that the opportunity here is global, not only to establish the framework for what works in North America, but for what works in the entire world and how we can create that paradise. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today. So I think the struggle of Halo, because a lot of people don't know about what Halo went through and what Flywheel went through too, to be able to be here today at this panel. It was not easy for us. People were not running in, giving us tons of money, saying you can do this. We spent years, myself at a previous company and Steve at several previous companies, trying to learn about this industry. I had a courier business actually in London. We had tremendous domain expertise. But actually, when we went to see venture capitalists initially, despite the fact that we had taxi drivers, the answer was too much competition. Too much competition meaning one well-funded Silicon Valley company. You can't do it. You can't ever do it. You can't make it work. They've already won. They're going to win. Why are you even trying? Does this sound familiar to you? You know, when you go and people come to you and talk about regulation and how the regulation should be structured in your particular city or town, sometimes it can seem that wave and that pressure and that force, particularly when it's funded by some of the best expensive lobbyists in the country, is insurmountable. But I'm here to tell you that it isn't, right? And I'm here to tell you, and I'm here today, and Steve is here today, because it is possible and it is better to endure. And that by doing so, that's the way that we're going to avoid costing the world a lot of expensive mistakes and costing people really, potentially, getting hurt in the process. And that's exactly what's happened in a lot of other things. So if I had to sum up Halo in a sentence, you know, Halo, we want to be the thing for all people, not just for the people with all things. That's basically how we compare to the other people in this marketplace. And there is a very big difference. We have been continuously focused on the drivers because we genuinely, passionately feel that drivers are the lifeblood of the circulatory system of the city, that to have a happy medallion owner, a happy fleet, it all starts with having the happy drivers and drivers that want to work for them, and the partnerships that come from that. And that ultimately, drivers are, I think, an untapped profession. I think we have seen, and I know Steve has seen this as well, that taxi drivers get trashed by a lot of our competition, by a lot of our companies. Many of you, started out your businesses by becoming, taxi drivers or working with them on a daily basis. They are great people. They are the engine of so many brilliant stories about the world, and they probably know more about it than most of us could possibly put together. All we have done here is put together a technology platform that has given them a voice and enabled them to actually function as a direct conduit to their customers, and to do it in a safe, legal, balanced way. So the last thing I'm going to end with, because I want to make sure we have time with questions, the other book that I keep reading lately is Animal Farm. I love that book. Right? And so everybody knows about Animal Farm. Animal Farm is really a book about wasted cycles. To summarize the parallel to what we're all going through right now, right? So people complain about regulation, and they say that, this regulation is restrictive, it's anti-competitive, it's protectionist, we gotta get rid of it. So we get rid of it. And then what happens? Well, then there's self-regulation, but ultimately human greed, and people push the envelope. And what do you get? We saw this exactly with what happened in 2008 in the banking crisis. Then you get companies that go out of control. You get markets that go out of control. People get hurt. And then what happens then? People start calling back for regulation. They rediscover, after all of those cycles and after all the people that have hurt and lost their houses and potentially lost their lives, why we have regulation in banking, why we have regulation in taxi, why we have regulation in the first place. Regulation is to protect us against ourselves. Regulation is a good thing. Regulation is there because it's meant to protect public safety and to enhance qualities of service. And so my message to everybody in this room that is involved in the industry is to try and think about how we make that paradise by how we evolve these regulations, not destroy them, and by how we stay the course and how we do it together. And so the very other exciting program that Halo is going to announce today is Halo Everywhere. It's also actually called Halo Anywhere, but we are going to be dramatically expanding our service within North America and to the rest of the world. Tom can tell you a little bit more about that. We'd love to talk about how we could bring Halo and Flywheel to your neck of the woods and do it in a safe, legal, and balanced way. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have about our service or your struggles.
Thank you, Jay. We are going to take some questions from the audience now. If anyone has a question, put your hand up, and we'll take the microphone around to you. I don't feel so bad bringing up the communist analogy now that you're talking about Animal Farm.
No, very
apropos.
apropos.
These. Remember at the end they had all the pigs kind of took over. It reminds me of the Who song, "Won't Get Fooled Again." Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So what could happen 10 years from now is that you have all of these angry apps leveling the playing field, taking over, deregulating, and then re-regulating, and taking control, and everybody gets pushed to the side. But let's hear from others.
Matt, while I wait for a hand to go up, I'll jump in then. As a farmer's daughter, I feel I've just been called to ask a question. And I'm thinking back to a slide yesterday, and this is to anyone on the panel that wants to take it, but it was observed that LA had the best month ever for demand for trips in LA. Anybody have some thoughts on that?
At the airport?
What's the question about it? We had a good month, and
I guess I am wondering, it's truly a question. I'm wondering, was that just the airport? Was that large, demand that was elsewhere?
Yeah, the airport demand for taxi service at LAX has been growing steadily since the economy bottomed out, and that growth has continued. However, on the outside the airport, overall demand for taxis is dropping. Most companies are reporting fairly significant drops. My company is down, I don't mind sharing with you, about 5.5% year over year. So we are seeing an impact of the app companies. While I have the mic, I have a question for Jay. Most of the regulators in this room know that the benefits of full-service taxi companies are absolutely clear in terms of having a company that's responsible to provide service to the entire community, having a company that takes on a lot of the regulatory burden, the quality control issues, et cetera. When you have an individual driver who sits at a hotel day in and day out and has no affiliation to a company, then you do not get service from that driver across the board, and you do not serve hard-to-serve communities, and that person does not pick up disabled people, et cetera. My company is a full-service company. We distribute about $400,000 a year in wheelchair subsidies in order to ensure that owners of cabs choose to buy wheelchair vans and drivers of cabs choose to pick up customers who need them. Your service is designed to get in the middle between fleets and their drivers, and it's the perception of our industry that your service ultimately devalues fleets, and I think the London experience I think those operators feel that, in fact, the fleet structure is devalued. So what is your company doing to ensure that the benefits of full-service taxi cab companies will remain with your business model?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for that question, because that question really cuts at the heart of what I think everybody is thinking. So thank you very much for asking it. I would like to point out, though, there are no fleets in London. It's a very important distinction. There are no fleets in London. London is a series of independent taxi drivers that are linked together only by other radio dispatch networks, but they are not fleets. They do not control the drivers. They do not control the chauffeurs in anything like in North America. Sorry, I'll say that. It's worth saying again, there are no fleets in London. It is a common misconception. There are no fleets in London. London taxi drivers are independent drivers. They take a 3-year test to become drivers. They take the knowledge. They have their own vehicles. The only thing that previously linked them together was radio taxi networks that did only dispatch, nothing else. So it is not fair to say that we've disrupted any fleets in London. We haven't. Absolutely not. There are none. There are none to disrupt. Have we had an impact on some of the radio dispatch networks? Of course, but not intentionally, right? Should we have sat back and done nothing? And actually, there's a great example of that. I'm sorry, I'm going to take 3 minutes to answer your question, because I think it really hits at the part of it. And really, my main message here is we view fleets as partners. We are actively seeking fleets as partners. We do not believe that fleets are in any way threatening to our business, nor we to theirs. We believe that working together, that we will make this industry better. We will make cabs more efficient. We'll make them more attractive places for drivers. And ultimately, we will make the need for these rogue and illegal apps that we're talking about completely non-existent. So just give me a minute to explain my thinking. I just got a message today, because there's a lot in what you said, from a disabled user in London, Toby Milden. Toby has testified before the Taxi and Limousine Commission in New York. He had his legs crushed in an accident, and so he can only use taxis. He's based in London. And Toby said, Jay, still loving Halo, still use it so often now. All the cabbies rave about it. Taxi driver, I just now said, please tell Jay he's doing a great job. He also says, when are you going to do account work? I have an account with Radio Taxis. This is this dispatch network, which helps me with cash flow, and they give me fixed price between home and work. But they add 30% on top of the fare for tip, booking, VAT, etc. I'd love to use Halo for these journeys so I don't pay over the odds. Fixed price is key since Access to Work only reimbursed me £31 per journey. This is a disabled person using a program called Access to Work to get them to work. So basically, we are making the market better off. We are providing disabled people, and have been since day one, with an additional safe and cheap transportation option. The other thing that we mentioned was full-service fleets. We will never be a full-service fleet. That is not our business. We are not buying cars. We are not buying medallions. We're nowhere near as good at as anybody in this business. We're just a technology enabler. But working together, what we can do, and we have proven that we have done, is we can make the cabs of full-service transportation providers up to 30% more efficient with no downside. No downside, no loss of control, no worries about stealing the drivers, et cetera, et cetera. So, we have a model that we would love to develop, and if any fleets are interested, we'd love to develop with you, where we can basically have our smartphones or smartphones that belong to the drivers. We can provide the Halo service, but we can do it in such a way, like we do in New York, where actually you get the requisite amount of information, but basically what you're doing is you're able to actually take the street hail portion of those drivers' work, and you're able to benefit from it.
There's a question.
Yeah.
I'm
very passionate
Could you
about,
stand up
about
and
this.
say hello and
Certainly
tell us who you
will.
are? And
Good morning.
let's
to
talk about
everybody.
that later.
My name is Ed Cargwell. I'm with Yellow Cab in Austin. Bill, I think you've done a fantastic job of detailing the disadvantages of deregulating the industry. I think most of the folks in the room understand those disadvantages, and that's a large part of why we're here today. Rich, you talked earlier about labor migration and how that's a factor in y'all's consideration when you're making investments. Taking into consideration the CPUC ruling and the California environment, this question is for Rich, it's for Steve, it's for Bill, and it's for Abu. And if Rich, you'll start by answering this question. Steve, you've been in San Francisco for, going 4 years now. Abu, you're at the airport. Bill, you're in LA. The CPUC ruling has come out. But if you will each, along your own timelines and specific to your own expertise, talk to us about labor migration. Rich, specifically, where do you see those numbers as you guys are studying that data? And then in your experiences as operators, Steve, Bill, and Abu, if you will give us some detail on what you're seeing with those numbers also.
Right.
And I'm talking about ride sharing specifically.
Right.
So labor migration from the regulated aspect
Right.
and crossing over to the deregulated aspect where, people are
Yeah.
going to want to go to a
It's a good
site
question.
where
The-
there's no rules.
Can we get that mic? Yeah, yes. Or the
so-
theft of, the stealing drivers from one to the other.
Right, and really what happens is our viewpoint is if there's a constant revenue stream, those drivers are migrating and producing drive revenues, maybe for themselves, but for different people. So the people that become disadvantaged or have disparate treatment are the fleet owners, the existing medallion owners who are flying within the regulatory framework and doing everything they can to provide a quality transportation where perhaps the other participants in the labor market are not. So we see a shifting of the labor. I don't think there's really too many jobs being added to the marketplace. And so therefore, those fleet owners that go and license out or lease out their medallions may have a smaller labor pool to drive from, which may impact the ability of them to charge the lease rate that they're able to charge under the regulated framework, and consequently it can impact their earnings as well. So it sort of dilutes and spreads the earnings out. I don't think either party is truly winning in this particular situation.
Okay, good. Anybody else?
We just think we've got to start by serving the customers. In order to protect our drivers and keep the drivers working with us, we're going to have to serve the customers. We're going to have to not rely on standards of excellence that we applied in the past. We're going to have to up our game there. The playing field is not going to be level, period, the end. We're going to have to work with our regulator in order to level the playing field as much as possible, but it's clear that we're going to be working in an environment without a level playing field. But this is all about revenue to the drivers, and we've got one advantage on our side, or we've got several advantages on our side, but we've got one very clear advantage, which is that we transport 300,000 passengers a month, and it's easier to keep your customer than it is to acquire a customer. And so we're working on several different approaches to up our performance level, but we are also have one hand tied behind our back in terms of the supply of vehicles and what it takes to increase our vehicle fleet in order to meet peak period demands, which is obviously the most vulnerable period of the day for the cab industry, and happens to be the most lucrative day for the period of the day for the road gap. So for us, the name of the game really boils down to the simple business proposition that we have to deliver service to the customers, and if we do so, then we won't have a problem losing drivers. I will tell you, thus far, with a 5% decline in business, we have lost very, very few drivers. We do not see a migration. We still have a very long waiting list for drivers at our company, but we've got to step it up.
So in San Francisco, you definitely have some of that issue. There are some taxi fleets that can't find enough drivers to drive their taxis right now. I think that is transitional because we find the fleets that are working with us, in fact, as Jay mentioned, we increase ride volume by 20 to 30% on a shift, just productivity that comes through the use of the technology, which again is available to everybody. And that's what it's all about. Drivers want rides, they want a great experience. They also want to deliver a great experience. So the average tip of an app-based fare is in the 22 to 24% range. So they also make more money on the tip side as well as more rides. That's what's going to bring drivers back and keep them going. So I think we're seeing some disruption in the labor market. I think it's going to revert to where the rides and the environment is. And just a short comment on LA, because we launched in LA about a month ago. We've seen ride volume going up there. And we do believe it's new drivers. We're out sponsoring a bunch of events. It's new passengers. So we've gone up nearly tenfold over the last month in LA. But every indication that we have is folks like my wife I mentioned earlier that are new people taking more rides around, and hopefully that'll spread to the whole market in LA.
Okay.
A quick comment from San Francisco, a ground zero for all of these app companies and the CPUC decision. I really want to encourage everybody from around the world and around the country not to take that CPUC decision very seriously, because honestly, it's indefensible. It raises more questions than it answers when it comes to insurance. It applies an inadequate standard of background checks. It requires these companies to regulate themselves and provides no public oversight. It allows the vehicles to operate without any kind of permanent markings indicating that they're for hire vehicles. And I think that in the end, and Matt asked what's going to happen over the next 5 years, I don't think that this business model is going to stand the test of time for all the reasons why there's been regulation of for-hire commercial transportation for the last 300 years. The experiment in deregulation is going to play itself out, and I think that in the end, the regulatory environment will prevail as long as we keep the regulatory environment down to what it really is required to do, which is to protect public safety and consumer interest. But that being said, the next 5 years or so is really going to be a battle, and I really encourage everybody to take that seriously. And I think that not just outreach to the public about why regulation is important, but in my jurisdiction, I feel it's very important to reach out to the drivers as well and say that we are going to have to step up our game. It's not just the fleets. We have to communicate with every single taxi driver that this is a customer service business. You do not have a monopoly. This car is not your living room. You're going to have to accept credit cards. You can't refuse short rides. And we're going to have to compete these businesses out of business. So I'm looking forward to doing that, and I hope you are too.
Sure. Abu?
The question about SFO and labor shift and all of those kind of issues, we are, it's a capacity and a demand kind of issue at SFO, really. We're seeing increased congestion because of these road gap kind of vehicles going around. Even from our taxi side, we're actually pushing out roughly 15 to 20% of cabs every single day. We're telling them to leave because they come in to the airport. There's no room for them in the airport, and the system is completely full. So that's what we're seeing. We're also seeing some limo drivers that were planning on becoming a legitimate limousine operator, waiting on the fence for the CPUC decision, saying, why do I follow your rules when I can get away with something such as these applications? So that's what we're seeing in SFO.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so I think we went over, but I think it was a really good, productive discussion. So, Ray has been uncharacteristically quiet, and he would like to offer his perspective and close this, and then we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we're going to be extending the next session, okay, a little bit longer to make sure that we have adequate time for the next session as well. So we're just about 10 minutes behind.
One thing about working with Matt, you never know quite what's going to happen. And I apologize, I'm only going to take 1 or 2 minutes. I do thank Abu, and I do thank the rest of the panel for a very delightful presentation, without a doubt. The Airport Ground Transportation Association has had for over a year a white paper, a policy paper, with respect to, at that time, what we called rogue apps. Airports are somewhat simplistic. We sort of, speaking too much on their behalf, sort of look out in the valley, if you will, and see this tremendous battle going on. Boy, a lot of money being poured into it, a lot of arguments going on about what's ride sharing, what's taxi service, what's limousine service. But we say, when you come up that hill or come over to our airport, we have certain objectives. One is revenue, of course. The other is safety, and I think Abu's little, even though it was funny, sort of says, this is why we regulate the curbs. If you are truly a ride sharing, and this is where I borrow some of my past experience as a researcher, as a university professor. Literally, we did a lot of ride sharing back in the 70s and 80s. We know what ride sharing is. We helped pass some of the laws. If you today, and I thank Steve Grassfield from San Antonio for reminding me that if you're a ride-sharing operation, you literally can charge, or take donations up to about 20 cents a mile, 20, 21 cents a mile now. So as an airport, I'm saying, look, if you are asking for donations, or you're charging less than 20 cents a mile and coming onto my airport, well, we'll follow our ride-sharing rules, and we typically have those. We were developed many years ago in the 70s and 80s. If, however, you look like a duck, walk like a duck, and literally charge more than that, you are a taxi company. And we have rules for taxi companies. You are going to have to be registered as a driver. We have TSA regulations. We are going to have the same requirements for your car as we do for the others in your category. We cannot discriminate as an airport. There are certain laws that say we cannot offer discriminatory treatment to you. So we are fairly straightforward in our policy. If you look like it, act like it, and operate like it, you are it. And we're going to treat you that way. There's no two ways about it. But we hope that the battle is settled out there in the valley, and you guys can literally sort things out. When I put on another hat, which I do have the opportunity to advise several cities at a time and so forth, it literally is go slow. Let others fight that battle if you can possibly. Let's see what's going to happen. We've been through deregulation before. I wasn't around in the 30s, even though my hair might look like it, but I was around for the second round of deregulations, and cities haven't, in some cases, never recovered from that yet, even though they've tried very much so over a period of years. We literally don't have the same kinds of taxi companies in all cities. That's one of the mistakes we make. And we start from a basis that if you're a 1-car or 10-car or 100-car or 1,000-car taxi company, you're all the same. No, you're not. They do different things. They have different operating procedures. And you cannot be a taxi company, I'm sorry, with 1, 5, 10 cars and a spider sort of technique using your cell phone radio. That's not covering the city. That doesn't achieve the objectives. So my advice has always been go slow. Let others be the first, second, or maybe even third bite off the apple, especially if you're a city that has a good full-service cab company or a structure like LA that has several and literally attempts to do that over a period of time. So this battle is far from won. There's a lot of money into it. We literally want to have you fight it out. We know what we're going to do at airports. We know if you say you're ride sharing and come up and you're really acting as a commercial operator, you're going to get fined. Your company's going to get fined. Thank God don't go to Salt Lake either. You may not be able to get out of jail if you can't pay your fine there. But I think airports have a solid foundation, and we are going to operate from that foundation. Thank you. Thanks to the panel. I appreciate it.